Thank you for joining me. This is another episode of FinTech Making Sense of Data, where we speak to leading data leaders in the FinTech space and pose them a series of questions of what they've been up to and some challenges they've faced in the space. How are you doing, Dan?
Very good, Ethan. Thanks for having me today.
No problem. So Dan is the Managing Director and Head of Data Governance at State Street Global Markets. Met Dan a couple of times and looking forward to getting things underway. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, what led you to the FinTech space in general, and what led you to bring your data expertise into the industry?
It's an interesting question. And I like to say that FinTech is really becoming all financial services firms. So it started out as, a bunch of startups that were creating very innovative capabilities. But I think the larger, players in the large banks have all realized they have to be FinTechs too, or at least have a part of them. Because banking ultimately is not about money anymore. It's about zeros and ones, and it can only be done on computer. So whether you're introducing, digitization capability or blockchain or whatever it is you're doing, digital transformation is really part of everything that's going on in the financial services today. And I think that's actually going to only accelerate from here as we start to adopt AI more and more. I came from a pretty traditional background. I started out as a programmer, working on database applications back, eons ago when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and went on to becoming a manager of programmers. Typically the principal where they move you up, so you keep doing your old job, except now you're managing the people that were doing your job. And I also got involved in large enterprise system implementations like ERP, enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management, data warehousing, data visualization, business intelligence, etc. So it's always been about data for me. I find it very interesting and, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle with, 40,000 pieces. And, the financial services industry for me is also very interesting and challenging because it's heavily regulated, because there are a lot of moving parts. My current firm, we have 3,000 applications, give or take. Every time we go count them, we find more. But the complexity of it all, you have to find a way to abstract away that complexity and manage it so that it can appear simple, at least to certain audiences, where until you get down into the dirt, into the weeds, into the detail, you can make that appearance of simplicity. So I just find it really interesting and fun. Lately, I've been much more into the people side, which I think we'll talk about later. But the the idea is that, like 92% of the challenge in becoming a digital or data-driven firm is not the technology. Believe it or not, the technology is the easy part. No one likes to hear that because they think, oh, the technology is so challenging. Yes, but the other stuff is even more challenging. So relationships, communication, org change, you name it. Those are the things that I find really interesting because that's where the difficulties really lie. And if you can kind of solve for those things, then a lot of times everything else falls into place.
Absolutely. I think that should resonate for quite a lot of data leaders that have been in a similar position as yourself. So, when it comes to bringing about that real business change and implementing that as a data leader, where do you think you should focus on as a starting point?
It's going to sound a little trite or maybe common sense. Show value. People are like, well, data governance, it just seems very bureaucratic and, lots of, compliance exercises. One thing, whenever we go to someone and ask them in the business, can you help us with X, Y, Z? Their first reaction is, you people, will you just leave me alone? And believe me, we would like to, but there's always a reason. We're asking on behalf of some other part of the organization, or guess what? We can't solve some other question until we first solve this question. So what I found is that if you show value, what you do is you create allies. So I'll give you an example. We had a data steward on our team. He was working with a development team that was implementing a new product. And they found they had 66 extract files that they thought they had to reproduce. And what my data steward was able to do is to look at the files and sort them and kind of say, look, they fall into 11 distinct categories or flavors, but each one is replicated 6 times. So you don't have to create 66 files, just create 11 files, and then you have 6 flavors of each file. So he dramatically simplified their work, by like 84%, going from 66 variations on a theme to 11 variations, and saved them a huge amount of time. And it was to the point where when that development team, they were part of a different part of the company, they got reorged out of our business unit, and they were now part of finance instead of part of my business unit, global markets. And they said, well, we know he's not really our data steward anymore, but can we please keep Ethan for the remainder of the project? So for 2 more years, he was their data steward on that project, even though he technically wasn't part of finance. And they just didn't want to give him up because they found what he did so valuable to them in their project.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic to hear. That's exactly the sort of change that can be brought about when you focus in the right areas. So, when you set out to change culture, what are the individual aspects that you could, changing culture is a huge task, particularly with data. So what are some of the ways to break it down and individual areas that you can focus on in improving?
I think communication is the first part, and it's often overlooked. People look at this and say, oh, we have to implement this technology platform, or we need a catalog, or we need metadata management or data quality or whatever. And all that may be true. But the first part is you have to be able to explain to a business person why we need this. What is it really going to do? The so-called what's in it for me, or with them. And so what I always try to do is to say, let's take an org change view of this. And I picked this up, frankly, from my ERP implementation days. We would be going in and doing these massive projects, teams of 150 people, and 7 different program managers working collectively in different areas. And we always had an org change representative on that team. And we might even have a whole separate org change team reporting to that person. And it was first and foremost about communication and education and awareness building, and helping people understand. People tend to resist change, and especially if they don't understand the reason for it, because then it just becomes change for change's sake, and they get change fatigue. And they have so much else going on in their world that this becomes like, hey, if I could just get rid of this and stop thinking about it and worrying about it and being part of it, then my life would be better. So what you want to do is help people kind of understand the current state, understand the future state, see this, the line between them as something that they want. And, the what's in it for me is, in the case I just gave you, it was, I'm going to save a lot of time on my IT project, and I'll be able to, deliver results more quickly. That's a pretty good what's in it for me. And so if you can show people that consistently, it's not enough to do it once and say, okay, we're done now. You have to be able to do it consistently. And another example that we ran into was we created a new data lake, and it was now kind of the strategic way of distributing data from our business unit out to the other parts of the company. And it had something like 22 subject areas that, data was being loaded into. And we went to the IT team and we said, we will commit to documenting this and, cataloging it very thoroughly, so that you always have a showplace of the benefits of data governance as part of a large IT project like this. But in return, you have to give us what we need. You have to give us the artifacts from the development process so that we can do that. And, we worked very collaboratively. They saw us as part of their team. We had weekly meetings. We maintained a scorecard of how far along we had gotten in our progress. And we got to like over 95% completion. And, these projects don't tend to stop. They're multi-year projects. So you can never heave a sigh of relief and say, okay, we're at our destination, everybody out of the taxi. It was more like, okay, there's a new release. We know it's going to introduce 13,000 new data elements. So let's get started on, grabbing the definitions for those data elements and doing the lineage and transformation documentation so we can kind of keep up, because you don't want your 95% completion to go to 50% as a result of one release. So we had to, keep up with them. But the value was that that resource became, it didn't turn into a data swamp. It stayed a data lake, which is often what happens. Things, they don't get documented, and then they eventually become kind of unusable because no one can tell where anything is, what it means, where it's going to, where it's coming from. And, once you lose the thread of that, it's a lot of work to get it back. It's easier to do it as you go. And as releases happen, you kind of go back and fill in the things that are now missing from the catalog and add them in and get them defined and get the lineage described, so that then it's just easier for them as they write stuff. And plus we would point out mistakes. We would say, hey, why are you putting that here? That doesn't belong there. According to the design guidelines you've told us about, that shouldn't go there. It should go over here instead. And they're like, thank you. We would not have caught that. That probably would have been over there in the wrong place for 6 months before we realized it. So it's a very collaborative working relationship between, in that case, IT and data governance. And, and the business finds that, they're able to shut down old ways of doing things and transfer them to the data lake much more quickly, in part as a result of our work. So it's very rewarding. And particularly from the kind of people development side, to get the data stewards on the team to see the need and the immediate benefit of what they do. And then that, is very motivating to them, because otherwise it would be like, oh, I have to go document 24,000 data elements in the data lake. But because they saw the impact, they were motivated, and they'd come in, 8 o'clock Monday morning and start, working away on the data lake because they knew it was going to have a big impact.
Absolutely. Communication in general is incredibly important there, and being able to communicate the value, utilizing people like data stewards for that, to get that result is optimal. Exactly. So we talked about what you want to do, and maybe the strategy for that, but in relation to influencing these people who you want on your side, and it's not as straightforward as changing technology and tools. Changing the hearts and minds of people is very tricky. So when you want to get this message across to people, how do you do that? What's a good tactic?
Well, I think you have to meet them where they are, and really understand your audience. So in any communication strategy, I try to have a formal editorial calendar of here's what we're going to do, kind of a project plan, if you want to call it that. And you start with the audience. Who are they, and how am I going to reach them? That's the second thing. Is what channels, what media, how do they prefer to be communicated to? Do I need a small group meeting? Do I need a town hall? Do I need a equivalent of a press release or announcement? Do I want a blog article? Do I want a newsletter? There's a lot of ways, obviously, to communicate. And then it's about the messages. How do I kind of put this out there, and probably have some kind of a drip campaign where I talk to them about the basics, and then the next stage is to kind of get into more detail and start to show benefit, and so on and so on. So by the time you're done, it's like you have a sequence of the audience characteristics and understanding them, the messages you're going to get across, and the channels that you're going to use to do it, and over what period of time, and who is going to do the work, because one person can never do a campaign like that. So even a simple thing like an awareness campaign is probably going to involve people from across the business, across IT, from within data governance, from maybe privacy, security, legal, and they're all going to focus on their aspect of that overall effort. But you want to be able to kind of tell the story. So I'm a big fan of data storytelling, and a good data storyteller, whether it be part of a data science initiative or really anything, being able to tell the story in a compelling way without going on, for 12 pages. So it has to be concise and readable. And honestly, you have to be able to do that consistently, because one or two blog articles, then you go away for 2 years. That's not going to work either. So it takes a lot of work, though. But I would put that kind of at the top of the list, because if you get the people part right, then a lot of other things kind of fall in place for you, or are less difficult later. It's not about technology. I won't say the technology doesn't matter, because obviously good technology is far preferable to bad technology. But the kind of acceptance and adoption and awareness have to be taken care of first. And then you kind of put them in front of the keyboard and say, okay, you kind of bought into this now. This is how we're going to do it. So focus on the why. And there's a great YouTube video from a guy named Simon Sinek, I believe, called Start With Why. And I think it was a TED talk that he gave on the difference between great companies and kind of average companies. And the great companies always kind of suck you in with the why. And then they talk about the how and the what and the when and the where. But the why is really the most important question. Why are we doing this? Why would we make this change? Why don't we just stick with the status quo? People tend to like the status quo. So if you're going to move them to something else, it has to be worthwhile, and they have to see the benefit and get excited about it. You have to inspire them and get the kind of middle managers to not just buy into it and kind of go along, but they have to then turn around and excite and inspire their teams. And other parts of the company, we did a lot in my firm with trying to inspire and educate and lead and mentor and develop all the other data governance units around the company, because it wouldn't really work if we were great and everybody else was terrible. So we said early on, we're going to make sure we spread the wealth, share this information. We had a weekly peer-to-peer meeting of the other data governance leaders around the firm. And it worked really well, because when they ran into something, they knew, first of all, they knew to call us, and we would walk them through it or give them a training session or share a document with them or whatever we had done. And then even if they chose to do it a different way, because that was what worked for them, they at least knew that, first of all, we cared about them as peers and that we had already solved this problem for ourselves, but we were willing to share that with them. And it made for a much more collegial atmosphere. So those calls became, almost like, a weekly family reunion of the data governance practitioners around the company.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of, how you want to go about handling such a big change to a business, and the sensitive ways to go about that, and certainly getting middle managers and everybody else to be as enthusiastic about data as you are is fundamental in that. One of the aspects that I find quite interesting is the almost internal competition in some ways. As a data leader, you're not going to be the only person who wants to bring change within the organization, and I think we're still at a stage where not everybody is 100% understanding and ready to adopt data necessarily. So when you're in that position and there's other people who want to have their voices heard, and you need to let the powers that be know how important data is and what you want to implement, how do you go about winning the main players over to your side?
Well, it isn't always going to be my side, because one of the things I've learned is to listen. That other leader, their vision might actually be better. So I don't start from a point of competition as much as I do just letting them have their say. And, they might be right. So there have been times when I've said, you've got your way of doing it, we've got ours, but I like yours better. So let's adopt that over here too. If I do think our way is better, or there's some compelling reason, then it just gets down to how good of a communicator are you? Can you really get people excited about it? It's data. And early on at my firm, I had someone say to me, I asked them, what do you think about data? And I was expecting, it's going to help us compete better. And, the answer was, I try to think about data as little as possible. So, but I get that, because it's like, when you pick up your phone to make a phone call, you don't think about the wonders of cellular communication and towers and, airwaves and frequencies. It's just, you make the call. So there are people that, data is really no more than a means to an end for them. They like the end result, the dashboard or the visualization or the AI or whatever, but they don't really want to think about everything in between. And I get that, but I think it's about realizing when is it better to kind of take one for the team and cooperate, and let the other group have their day in the sun, because it can't always be you winning. People hate that. They're like, I will go out of my way to take that guy down. So some of the time you have to say, even if it's not better, it might be the same. Maybe it doesn't matter which way they go. Their way and my way, they might be just as good as each other. So when it really matters, you need to be able to rally people to your side and explain why it's so important and fight like hell and don't give up and find a way to explain to, your boss and their boss and so on, why are we digging in our heels on this, which we've had to do a couple of times. But in the end, it's always going to be about what's best for the company. And I think as long as you have that first and foremost, and you care about your people and your team, people will understand. They're like, look, I didn't agree with you on this, but in the end, I kind of came around to, even if you weren't right, you weren't wrong. And so I'm kind of glad that communication skills are something that I've been trying to work on for really my whole career, because if you can communicate well, that covers just about every other sin you might have.
100%. I think that sometimes the diplomatic approach is much better than trying to win every battle.
Yes.
It's for the greater good in many ways, and hopefully there's a lot of probably existing leaders and aspiring leaders that can take some words of advice from what you've said there, Dan, and implement that into their own path in the data world. So Dan, absolute pleasure having you on. It was good to chat again. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Thank you, Ethan. I did. It was a great conversation, and I'd love to be on again sometime when you get back around to me in the rotation, and we'll have another conversation.
Fantastic, Dan. I love to hear it. We'll speak again soon.